Hello and welcome to the first podcast looking at self-reflection as an assessment. Have we reflected on why we're doing it? My name is Alistair Jones and I was one of the co-presenters along with Ros Lishman who looked at this topic. Now this is the first of two podcasts that we're going to be doing. This one is just going to be me by myself. There will be a second one which was going to come out into the Politics Department podcast series, and we will flag that up to everyone. There'll be a number of us getting involved in that. But for now, what we're going to have is an immediate reflection on what we did in the Learning and Teaching Conference of 2021. So, as I say, self-reflection as an assessment. Have we reflected on why we're doing it? Myself, Alistair Jones, and Ross Lishman, both of us in the Department of Politics, People and Place in the Faculty of Business and Law. If you want to get hold of us to discuss this podcast further, our emails are there on this opening slide here. So anjones@dnu.ac.uk and rlishman@dnu.ac.uk. We would value your thoughts and your inputs into the paper for those that attended and for those that didn't in this brief podcast. Just to note, most importantly, that I can't cover everything in this podcast for the simple reason that some of the materials that we used in our podcast could be linked back to individual students. Very, very difficult. But under ethical rules of the university, we're not going to do this. So we run a couple of scenarios. I can't go into them in this. And this was why the whole presentation, the whole workshop was not recorded on the day. But how we started it off, because we knew that people might trickle in, we actually got people to think about the whole conference, to get them pausing and reflecting. So actually to get staff members to be reflecting on something. And then the plan was to get people to get involved and to feedback on their thoughts on the day. And this was to get people in the mode of having a workshop where we're going to be doing things. Because one of the important things is when you start a class, maybe students might get there early. It is important to actually be doing something with them that is related to the class, then others can also filter in. So we asked for people what were the thoughts of the conference on the day, and we committed ourselves to keeping anonymized capture of reflection. So I've just highlighted 3 points here that colleagues put forward. They talked about too many things going on the day, that there was so much to pick and choose from, it was very, very difficult. One person commented most interestingly on their self-reflection on their own practices as a result of what they'd been to on the day. And then for many people, I suspect there's one comment from one individual who claimed that they missed the hubbub of people. And I think a lot of people missed that, the idea of being able to interact with colleagues, not just on the panels and in the workshops, but actually during the day. So these were the things that we thought that people came up with. Now, Ros and I, we made our own list of things that we thought people come up with. They might have talked about the panels that attended or missed, but we saw that with the volume. Nobody commented on paper of their own workshop or anything they participated in, although there was that comment about self-reflection and what they were doing. So these were the sorts of things that we thought people might come up with. So that's just to highlight that. But from there, after this, we'd spent 3 or 4 minutes on this. We then actually moved on to the workshop. So the workshop was quite simply to focus on self-reflection as a form of assessment. Now, while we're getting a podcast about this here, we could have run it as a paper. We could have actually done it where we merely stood up the front and expressed about our experiences and our practices, and sort of like the sage on the stage, a phrase that Ros likes to use quite a lot. And I think that we decided not to do that. We decided it was going to be a workshop. So in this interactive workshop, so Ros and I were not going to be speaking all of the time. The plan was to have 2 separate scenarios on student self-reflection based on actual assignments. And what we wanted to do with these 2 scenarios was to get the people on the panel in the workshop to actually look at some of the comments about some self-reflections and to consider how they might assess them. Now, as I said before, we cannot present the information about the 2 scenarios as there's a chance that students can be identified. So what I've got instead is some brief generic feedback about those scenarios, and then I will carry on with what we did in the rest of the workshop. So the scenarios basically asked around how you distinguish between perceived self-reflections, and in particular, if there are discrepancies. So one of the issues that you have in self-reflection is what happens if there is an outlier. If one individual in a group has one self-perception, self-reflection as to what happened, and it is totally at odds with everyone else. And we wanted the staff to explore how they might assess these discrepancies in their marking of such work. Now, in fairness, some of the people in the workshop said, well, we don't know what the learning outcomes are, we don't know what the learning criteria are, we don't know what the assessment criteria are. And we stuck up our hands and said, yes, don't worry about that. Let's just focus on one narrow aspect, these discrepancies. And then we also broadened it out as we got some of the feedback about this from the staff. And one issue was if problems have been raised by the students, so they're saying, hey, our group's not working properly, it's not working very well, to what extent should that information be taken on board when you actually mark their assignments? Now, bear in mind as well, we've got anonymity with regard to the marking. So it becomes even more difficult. So when you build in your thoughts, your ideas on all of this is hugely important. Now, what we then did after we'd explored the two scenarios is we gave some more information. So we highlighted, for example, in scenario number one, the learning objectives and the assessment criteria. So what you've got here is very clearly the learning objectives of the module. And you can see the extent to which the self-assessment, the self-reflection is built in onto this and to where it leads. So learning objective number 5, reflect critically on your personal employability. So this is something that is very, very important. And even the learning objectives, all of them are focusing upon the critical skills, the intellectual ability, management skills, group work, teamwork. All of this matters in the first scenarios module. And then you can see the assessment criteria as well, where it is all built in and how the assessment goes forward. Now, in the second scenario, the module involved, there is very little that is clear in relation to the learning outcomes and the self-reflection. Arguably, you could look at number 5 and number 6, developing skills in finding, using, and evaluating a variety of information sources, actually explore some of the critical thinking behind self-assessment. And then enhance skills in written and oral communication, problem solving, and collaborative working. So some of it's there. But you can also see the information on the simulation game, which relates to this particular scenario and the module. Now, what we then got throughout all of this workshop was a lot of feedback from the staff members who were there involved in this. And the next slide, I have drawn from the chat, as well as from some of the verbal comments that were made in relation to what the staff members on the workshop threw up. So reflection is always going to be a perception. And this, I think, is a really fantastic little statement about this self-reflection. It is a perception. You perceive what you have undertaken, and you are then going to hopefully be critical, positively and negatively, in what you're doing, and you'll be wanting the students to be doing the same. But then we get some other interesting problems. To what extent should emotions be included? So should the students in their self-reflection be actually quite emotive in their writing? Should they be using particular language, the use of I? Now, Ros and I would both encourage the students to do this, but for some people they may not be appropriate depending on what they want to do. But your emotion in all this, what you've invested and you got back out of it, is an important part of this self-reflection, and colleagues raised this as a particular important point. Thirdly, an understanding of self. Students need to know what we mean by self. Maybe we need to give them a bit of a steer in what is involved in this. But throughout all of it, the next bullet point, subjectivity. There is a degree of subjectivity in what the students are writing. So the question then becomes, how subjective should we be in our assessing these submissions? Now, that is something that probably needs much greater exploration. But some of it is addressed in the next bullet points. Need to be clear about the aims of the assignment and what is being assessed. So as long as it is clear, what is this self-reflection assignment trying to achieve? How is it being marked? What are you looking for? As long as that is there and that is clearly reinforced throughout the whole process, then the students should feel more comfortable in relation to what it is they're writing. And then another interesting comment in relation to the subjectivity. Reflection is all to do with the angle of the mirror. Now, the problem you have in marking such reflections may be that you don't know what that angle necessarily is, which is why the previous point about the clear aims of the assignment and what is being assessed is so important. Now, something that both Ros and I tried to highlight in our two scenarios and came through in the chat quite a lot is the link between self-reflection and employability. And I'll touch upon that a little bit more in a subsequent slide. And then there was a lovely question, is it possible to fail a self-reflection assessment? And the response that Ros and I gave is, it is possible to have a brilliant self-reflection about a project that failed. And it is important that if that self-reflection is brilliant, even though the project fails, it is the self-reflection that is being marked. Conversely, a project could be absolutely brilliant and it could be hugely successful, but the self-reflection be very weak, and possibly therefore it could fail if it doesn't meet the learning outcomes or the criteria of what is being assessed. So in this respect, we would argue it is possible to fail a self-reflection assessment. So these are some of the feedbacks that came back from the workshop participants, and I've embellished a little bit upon some of those. How Ros and I drew the workshop to a close, we looked at two parts. We looked at our concluding reflection students, and then our concluding reflections for staff undertaking these types of assessment. So the first thing with students, pedagogy and assessment criteria matter. So for the students, they need to know what is being done. They need to be able to use the tools of self-reflection. They want to be aware of what is, for example, a SWOT analysis, or maybe they want to use mind mapping. There's many other ways in which self-reflection can be undertaken, and they need to be aware of what is available and to be able to choose what is most appropriate for them. Thirdly, there needs to be clarity on what the students should be reflecting. You know, is it about the whole project? Is it their role in the project? Is it their role in the team? What is it? But also why they're undertaking the task. So some examples there, developing employability skills, for example, such as interviews. And it's that special POD, what sets you apart from the rest? As we try to explain to our students, when you're applying for jobs, if you're applying for postgraduate study, what sets you apart from everyone else that someone looking at shortlisting or someone interviewing goes, wow. And this is something that we want them to actually be able to do. We need them to become reflective practitioners in the workplace. We as staff members do it. We undertake appraisals. And it is a norm in the workplace. And therefore, these type of reflective assessments help students to develop that skill. And it's about lesson learning. Lesson learning is critical, as we say on the slide, to performance enhancement. So that's for the students. For the staff, I think the first thing to note is that self-assessment is not as easy as first envisaged. Some people appear to think, oh, I'll throw in a self-reflection part, it's going to be dead easy to mark. But we would question the extent to which that is the case. I mean, there's simple things such as use of language. In a self-reflection, we would argue the use of the word I, or in my opinion, things like that, which we don't like to see in an essay necessarily, should be acceptable in a self-reflection. It is about self. But other things for staff, to what extent do you or should you check how accurate the student submission is? So if a student has an outlier in a group, that their self-reflection is totally at odds with everyone else in that group, should we actually check up and see if what they've said is true or not? Now, what complicates this as well is the need for anonymous marking. So if there's anonymous marking, how can you check the veracity of the student submission? And this is something about which we need to be thinking very carefully. And ultimately for staff, these forms of assessment can be highly subjective, as has been noted throughout this particular podcast, comments from staff earlier. And it's also emotional. Some students may be highly critical of the whole project that has been undertaken. And we have got to, in some respects, separate our feelings about that with what is written. It is possible for a student to reflect upon a particular piece of work they've got to do for an assignment, and the self-reflection says, this module was not fit for purpose, and explain why. From their perception, their self-reflection is, this module did not help me because, and they explain why. Now, we may not like that, having invested so much time and effort in designing the module, in designing the assessment, in explaining the learning outcomes, in explaining what we're trying to achieve. But that emotional part is going to be there. And therefore, we need a degree of detachment from that huge emotional baggage that comes with us. So to draw this particular podcast to a close, I hope it's provided a useful summary of what Ros and I did on the paper. And as I say, if you want to get hold of us to chat further, please email us. We're happy to respond to emails. If there's any feedback about the podcast, I would particularly like that. There will be more coming from us in relation to this. So as well as hoping you enjoyed the podcast, please watch this space for more. Thank you.